All right, what's going on, everybody? Zombies here again, and today we're back with another Marvel Snap video. So today we are taking a look at Infinite Decks of the Week. This is week number 4, the final week for the Animals Assemble season. This is the series where we take a look at all the different decks that players have been using to hit Infinite with in this past week in the community. Between the big shakeups we had in balance a week ago with the patch and the OTA adjustments made just a few days ago, there is a lot of exciting stuff to see here in terms of decks that people have been having success with. Before we dive on into the decks, I do want to mention we have an article about this as well, so if you want an easy place to grab the codes or see a little bit more of in-depth writing overviews on some of these decks, definitely encourage checking out the article. The link will be in the description. And if you enjoy this type of content, consider liking and subscribing here to Marvel Snap Zone's YouTube channel. Alrighty, so the first deck we're taking a look at here is a little bit more of a budget-friendly list, only using Pool 3 cards, 3 Pool 3 cards, no cards in Pool 4 or above. This is from Marvel Guy 808, getting their second time Infinite during this season, and it's a pretty neat list. This list is actually kind of a throwback for me. I remember playing a lot of these kind of more basic style control decks that are trying to control the game with things like Storm, Jessica Jones. They got Spider-Man thrown in there for some more control elements. And these are really effective early on in the Pool 3 experience and clearly later on as well. So the idea with this deck is we just have a pretty good high quality of cards. We have some disruption with Iceman. We have some flexibility in Nightcrawler. Scorpion also gives us a way to interact with the opponent's power a bit, knock them down a peg. Blizzard still really good with things like Storm, where they're not likely to be able to fill up the lane, so we don't have to worry about that drawback, especially now that it got worse recently. Sunspot, obviously an MVP with Storm, as is Jessica Jones. And we have some powerful tech cards here to swing the game in Shang-Chi and Enchantress, making use of the newly buffed Enchantress, who I think will make this deck even more powerful than it already was. And then the Pool 3 cards we have here, we have Spider-Man, another lane control element. Lock down one lane with Storm, another lane with Spidey, and you're probably pretty good to go. Captain Marvel is nice because sometimes maybe you only have one lockdown lane or 0 lockdown lanes and you're not sure where the opponent's going to play. So she can be very clutch at the last minute to flip things around if you didn't guess the right lane. And obviously has good synergy with Storm as well if we need to get something in that Storm lane during the final turn. And then Dr. Doom, just going wide is really good. Dr. Doom is one of the best 6 drops in the game right now, in my opinion. Really, really strong card and just gives you a lot of flexibility in being able to fight for all 3 lanes. Then we have my good friend and fellow Marvel Snap Zone content creator, Safety Blade, making it to Infinite on his alternate free-to-play account. So more slightly budget-friendly stuff going on here. And this actually has a deck we featured in the OTA update video, the Shauna Ultron Zoo style Patriot deck. A really unique build. I think this is a really fun build that can kind of take people off guard. They won't really see some of the cards in this deck coming, like Iron Man or Sandman, or maybe they don't expect the Patriot if you're just spamming the board with, you know, Ant-Man and Armor and Shauna. But he actually did this climb just before the OTA changes went live, so I do think it's neat that now this deck is getting even better. Now Shauna's going to be a 4/4, and as someone who's played quite a bit with Shauna after the recent OTA changes, that extra 2 stats really does make a difference sometimes. It makes her from being a bad play, aside from the 1-drops, into actually a pretty decent play for the cost. So I'm definitely excited to give this one a spin. Definitely a more unique take on the archetype. And even though Sandman is now a 5/3, the effect is still the reason you're running him in a deck like this. So I don't expect that to be changed very much. And then also mentions he used a Deathwave style deck here. I like this version a lot. I'm a big fan of Iceman and Deathwave. I think the disruption is very valuable. I do miss the inclusion of Arrow a little bit. I think she's still a little underrated here. But it's also possible he might not have Arrow on this account yet, since it's free to play. He does mention using the deck here for the Monster Island hot location. I do think it's worth shouting out that if you are having a tough time on your climb, I can't overemphasize enough that being able to pivot and lean into some of these hot locations, or go kind of the opposite direction, and instead of leaning into the hot location itself, leaning into a deck that might counter the decks that are leaning into the hot location, is a really effective way to kind of juice up your climbing. And I know myself and many others have found that instead of being kind of like stubborn and just trying to brute force whatever you feel like playing, if you're willing to lean more into these hot and featured locations, you'd be surprised at how much it can have a positive impact on your climbing experience. Another deck we have here on the more budget side of stuff is from Mr. Patriot. This is definitely more budget-friendly junk control style deck. So if you like flooding the opponent's board with more stuff and kind of locking up their lanes and winning that way, this might be a deck for you to try. And it is a more budget-friendly list using no pool 4 or pool 5 cards. So I've played a lot of junk control. It's a really fun archetype. I think it's one of the most fun archetypes in the game. Your opponents might disagree with that. People don't typically like their lanes getting locked up. I think as far as budget decks go, this is a pretty solid version. Very good includes here. We got the classic Viper Hood shenanigans. We have Titania Green Goblin. Very good synergy there. Polaris Debris. A lot of these just like little synergy packages that work very well together. Beast is an interesting include, but it does have some very nice synergy with things like the Hood and Iceman, which is pretty cool. Mojo, just a way to boost your power in a lane where you know the opponent is going to have it filled because you're going to kind of fill it for them. Spider-Man provides a bit of lane control to lock things out towards the end of the game. Shang-Chi to flip a lane where they're ahead by a lot with a big thing. And then Doc Ock, a little bit more controversial include, I'd say, in these junk style lists, but he definitely can be really good to just fill up the lane. He kind of fits with the general style of the deck. You do have to be a little weary about the times he accidentally pulls a Shang-Chi on you. But overall, I love the junk archetype, so it's really cool to see someone having success with it with a pool 3 only version. Then we have our first discard deck of the bunch. This one's actually featuring Stature, and it's pretty cool to see a Stature deck that's actually trying to lean into more traditional discard stuff rather than just kind of running Black Bolt and or Moon Knight in a just otherwise differently focused deck to get the Stature benefit. We're going to look at one of those decks too, but this one is coming from DJ Superflow. And definitely seems like a really interesting list here, especially interesting seeing a Helicarrier. It's not a card you see many people running, but it is a pretty cool card for this type of archetype. Other than that, just a lot of your standard cards for discard here. You're running the Colleen Swarm stuff, you're getting Morbius, you want to get your Apocalypse discarded a bunch, so you're using things like Sif, Moon Knight, Hellcow, so that you're kind of always discarding stuff. Hopefully make that Apocalypse nice and big. Or discard that Helicarrier so you get even more gas in your hand to keep the kind of discard train going. A little bit surprised at no MODOK here, but I guess it makes kind of sense because you don't want to really be discarding your Stature, so discarding your whole hand is a bit more of a risk with this style of deck. And so we're leaning on the Black Bolt stuff to discard the opponent's stuff as well as Moon Knight. So hopefully we provide a little bit of disruption there, and then we can kind of slam Stature on the final turn with some other good cards to close out the game. So really neat list. Definitely not one I've seen before for Stature, but definitely could be a interesting direction to try if you want a more discard-centric list focused around her. The next deck we have here is another Stature deck, and this one was actually submitted via Discord. So if you want a chance at having your deck featured on the show, you make it to Infinite, feel free to check out the Marvel Snap Zone Discord. You can post there, or you can at the Marvel Snap Zone Twitter account for a chance to have your Infinite deck featured on the show. This is another Stature deck. I really like the direction they went with this. This seems more of a kind of control-y Stature deck. And I've really liked Moon Girl shenanigans with getting multiple Statures, multiple She-Hulks. It's like a very powerful way to close out the game. They actually are running Colleen and Swarm as just like a little bit of a value package, which is interesting to see. This does opt for Moon Knight as well, so I guess the Swarm gets a bit more value there, so you have another way to possibly discard it while interacting with your opponent's hand, so our Stature will only cost 1 mana towards the end of the game. Obviously, Black Bolt helps out with that as well. But other than that, just a really good quality of cards here. Some of the best 1-drops in Sunspot and Iceman. A good 3-drop in Mr. Fantastic to spread the power around. Newly buffed Enchantress, looking real thick in this deck. That 2 power has gone a long way into making her more of a valuable consideration for decks outside of Sarah Control, and Shang-Chi for dealing with opponents' big stuff. I really like these versions of Stature. I've never seen one that tries like the small swarm package, but it definitely could be worth experimenting with. So this is one definitely have to try out if you're looking for more interesting stuff to do with Stature. Another old school deck that seemed to be making a bit of a comeback recently is Sarah Surfer Control. This one's coming from Shing378, and seems they use this deck to take advantage of the recent Sandbar hot location. So pretty interesting list. I could definitely see this doing super well against Patriot. They have the cheeky Rogue inclusion here. And I mean, Rogue is just kind of the nuts against something like Patriot, where if you are able to get priority and you can snag that Patriot before they can copy it with Mystique, it can just totally flip the game on its head. It's also worth noting that there's been a bunch of Super Skrull around, so being able to kind of take that away from the opponent and then suddenly get the benefits of all their ongoing cards is pretty sweet. I do think Rogue is kind of an underrated card right now, especially in an archetype like this. Obviously, a lot of decks, if they want to be countering the ongoing effects, are going to be running Enchantress, but for Surfer decks, whether you're on the Sarah list here or might go for a bit more of a Mr. Negative approach, I think Rogue still has a lot to offer in those style decks, where being a 3-drop is really, really important. Other than that, it's a pretty standard Surfer deck. I do think people are kind of underrating Surfer, especially the power of Killmonger. I think we're going to see a whole lot of that coming back as the new season joins us on Monday with a powerful new 1-drop making its way into the game in Nebula. But yeah, this is definitely a control-y style list. We have things like Polaris to move the opponent's cards around. Mr. Fantastic lets us go pretty wide with the power. Cosmo, one of the best counter cards in the game. Iceman and Scorpion for a little bit of interaction. Sarah to get us to play 3-3-drops on the final turn. Always a powerful thing to do. And then just some generally good cards like Maximus, Bishop, and of course the Surfer staple in Brood to get a bunch of 3-drops onto the board. Our next build here is another control-y style deck from Lauren Whatever. And she talks about having some inspiration of trying her own kind of build again, and it's always super satisfying when you're able to make that infinite climb with your own unique brew. And this is a pretty cool one. This is a little bit of a different take on Valkyrie Control. Now that Valkyrie is pool 3, she's a lot more accessible, and I do think she was a pretty underrated card. Does some really powerful things. I like the style of this build a lot. Valkyrie has always succeeded the most in these kind of lane lockdown style decks, so you force your opponent into having to play into where you want to be going with the Valkyrie, rather than them just being able to kind of ignore the Valk lane if they're too afraid of it. So we have the Storm Juggernaut stuff for locking down one lane that way. We have Spider-Man and Professor X for potentially locking down another lane. You really do want all that redundancy in this deck because it's very important that you do end up locking down a lane. I really like the Jeff inclusion. Jeff is pretty cool, lets us get into that Storm lane or that Professor X lane if things don't go exactly as planned the first time around. Also has very nice synergy with Angela, who I think is generally an underrated card in these Valkyrie style decks, as we need multiple ways to break the Valk ties if the lanes are both full and all become 3 power. So Angela's a way to do that, Ant-Man's a way to do that, the Hood with the Demon is a way to do that. We have quite a few different ways here to break the ties with Valkyrie. Mr. Fantastic, also a good way of circumventing that as well. And Maria Hill, kind of an interesting inclusion here. I imagine the idea behind this is it's not a terrible tempo play, and it gives us another 1-drop that we can weave in with Valkyrie if we don't have access to our other ones. So really cool build here, and it's always nice seeing someone able to complete the climb with their own personal home brew. Next up, we have a little bit more of a standard list here. This one coming from Jack506086. And this is just the Super Skrull Patriot that's been going around and popularized pretty recently. Still a very powerful version of the deck. Obviously, with Enchantress popping up more, you do have to be a little bit careful with Patriot, but I think that by no means is going to totally push it out of the meta. I think it still has a very valid place in the meta, especially if Sarah Control decks start to get more popular with the Enchantress buff, So we need kind of Sandman to come back, deal with those, and then this will deal with the Sandman. But not a whole lot to say here. The Abomination Include is working well for a lot of people, it seems, and being able to go a bit taller with it. I do think Cosmo and Debris have been definite all-stars, and Cosmo, especially now that we need a little bit more protection from more Enchantress going around. We have pretty stock standard list, but still very efficient at getting the job done if you want to go the Patriot route. The next deck we have here comes from Chupa on the Marvel Snap Zone Discord. And this is a really neat deck, and I've actually seen a few different people trying something like this, and I think there's definitely something here. And so this is trying to merge the Thanos deck and the Dark Hawk deck while adding a few elements of a lane control into the mix. And I really like what's going on here. Thanos kind of gives us a much more robust early game than we typically have with this style of deck, while also allowing us to kind of cycle through and find the other cards we're looking for. But we have the disruption elements of like Korg and Rock Slide, which will obviously grow the Darkhawk. Mystique has some good copy targets here with Devil Dino, Darkhawk, Blue Marvel. We have Spider-Man and Professor X here for a little bit of lane control, so we really only have to focus on one lane when it comes to the final turn of the game. Really interesting idea. I'm curious to see people experiment with this more. Obviously, we've seen the Darkhawk shell has a lot of potential. It's been put in a bunch of different decks, from standard Dino to Sarah Control to just general good stuff piles. So I'm really curious to see how this version of it with Thanos continues to evolve. Next up is one I am super happy we get a feature here. This comes from a good friend and fellow co-host with me on the Born to Be Cosmo podcast, Nate Wolf, and Nate made it with a Jefflactus deck. So this is something I tried out, a little bit different version when Jeff first came out, but the idea with this deck is that we have Jeff here to help us fight for priority a bit with the Galactus deck, and then we move Jeff out of the way so we have some options in terms of where we can Galactus. Galactus is a very unique deck in terms of you really benefit a lot from gaining priority with it going into your Galactus turn, but then a lot of times you want to throw priority after that so that way you don't get Shang-Chi to lose the game. So pretty standard includes here, although a little bit different than some typical lists, opting to drop the Chavez for a Killmonger to deal with some of the pesky 1-drops that can stand in your way, like rocks or squirrels. He went all in on the ramp package, which usually isn't something we're seeing very much anymore, but interesting to see nonetheless. And then obviously Jeff. Jeff, not only does he have some utility in terms of being able to help us fight for priority a bit, which is especially good if one of the location lanes is like a lockdown lane where the opponent can't play into it. That can be really, really nice with Jeff. Jeff also, now that Professor X is becoming more popular, Jeff gives us an out to people who Professor X your Galactus, which is pretty cool. And it also gives us an out in the mirror match if both Galactus players end up getting their Spider-Man down on turn 5. Well, Jeff doesn't care about being Spider-Man. So a really cool build. If you're looking for something a little bit different to try with Galactus, I do think Jefflactus is an absolute joy to play, and just a really funny version of the deck. And then the last deck we have here is a Doomwave deck. This one was also submitted via Discord from T-Mage. I like this a lot, actually. I think Doomwave is a little bit underrated, personally. I think the inclusion of Enchantress over Shang-Chi makes a lot of sense for this type of deck, though obviously you will have to be a little careful about it, because you do have ongoings that you don't want to hit, like your Darkhawk or your Fantastic or Zabu. But usually pretty easy to avoid, and sometimes, unless it's Darkhawk, you don't really mind hitting your own Zabu if it's like the final turn of the game or whatever. But Doomwave continuing to be a very powerful deck, trying to tempo out really well, get wave down on turn 5, and then close out the game with something like Doctor Doom or Darkhawk plus She-Hulk. Or even Enchantress. Enchantress actually adds a really nice addition here in terms of a powerful thing we can do to swing the game. Shang-Chi was obviously pretty common in that spot before, and could still be a worthy consideration, but I do like the inclusion of Enchantress here. We also have Jeff. Jeff continuing to be a powerhouse. I do think he has shown up in more lists than any of the other new cards that dropped this season, so Definitely worth your consideration if you're looking for a very powerful 2-drop to add to a lot of your different decks. As we can see, he has just a lot of different homes that he goes in very nicely. These Doomwave lists have been around for a while, and I'm sure we'll continue to see slight iterations as new cards come out, but a very solid choice for kind of a mid-rangey deck that tries to shut down the opponent's ability to play a lot of cards on the final turn, which might be really good if Sarah continues to make a very prominent comeback, which is expected, especially given that a 1-drop is going to be our new Season Pass card in a few days. That's going to wrap it up for the video, though. We went over a ton of different decks today, a lot of cool things that people were able to achieve Infinite with. So whether you're trying to make a final push before the season ends, or if you're just looking for something different and powerful to try next season, we've got you covered with a ton of different decks here. And as always, link in the description where you can easily find and import these decks to do the game. That's going to close it out for this one, though. If you enjoyed it, remember to like and subscribe. Let me know what you thought about some of the decks in the comments below, and I'll catch you in the next one. Peace.